Okay, moving along. So our second paper is Retirement Prospects for Millennials. What is the early prognosis? And the presenter will be Richard Johnson from Urban, and the discussant will be Wang from Georgetown.
Great, thank you, John. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Social Security Administration for funding this research, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Karen Smith, Damir Cosic, and Claire Wang. Now, one of us is, in fact, a millennial. It's not me, just in case you're wondering. But that's not why we're writing about how millennials will fare in retirement. We need a millennial to figure out how to do this for me. There we go. What motivated this paper is really just to address growing concerns about why or about how future generations of older people will fare in retirement. And that concern is growing for a couple of reasons. One is we know that retirement outcomes depend largely on how much people earn and save at younger ages, and really how much their families earn and save at younger ages. And yet employment patterns and earning patterns and marriage patterns are shifting. We also know retirement financing is changing, so that Social Security is going to be smaller in the future than it is or has been in the recent past because it's a higher full retirement age is cutting benefits, and because benefits are increasingly subject to taxation. And then finally, consumption needs may be growing, which may affect people's ability to save and affects how much they need in retirement. So we know that healthcare spending is rising, or at least we project it will rise in the future. College is more expensive today than it was in the past. And then life expectancy is increasing, so people's resources have to last longer. So what we do in this paper is we compare various cohorts at different ages across a lifetime over time. And we're going to look at some historical household survey data from the March CPS and from the Survey of Consumer Finances, which gives us high-quality data on household wealth. And then we're going to use some dynamic microsimulation techniques to project retirement income at older ages. Before I get to the details, let me give you a quick summary of what we found. First, there's no reason to panic, at least not yet. There are some concerning trends. So for example, we find that employment and earnings are stagnating, retirement plan coverage seems to be eroding, household debt is rising, all that is troublesome. There is some good news though, and that is that millennials are better educated than previous generations. That means they can earn more. Women are earning more than the women who are currently retired did in the past, so that's good news. And then people are working longer. What our projections show is that the age 70 incomes will be higher for the millennials than for previous generations, adjusting for inflation. And yet, that income will be able to replace only a smaller share of their pre-retirement earnings, suggesting that that millennials are more at risk of seeing their living standards fall than existing generations of retirees. So to get to the details, so first for the historic data, with the CPS and the SEF, we had these repeated cross-sections. What we can do, though, is we can use that data to construct synthetic cohorts. So we can look at outcomes, let's say for a 5-year group, people 21 to 25 in 2011. We can look at an aggregate outcome for them, and then compare it to another sample of people who are 5 years older 5 years later, so people who are 26 to 30 in 2016. And by comparing those two outcomes, we can say something about how that cohort is faring as they age. So in the March CPS, we're going to look at data over a 50-year period from 1966 to 2016. We're going to look at them every 5 years and construct 5-year synthetic cohorts. We're going to do the same thing for the SCF. The data isn't quite as long, so we have data from 83 to 2013, 1983 to 2013, and we're going to look every 6 years at outcomes. One thing to keep in mind, though, when we're looking at these results and comparing outcomes across cohorts, is remember that microeconomic shocks are hitting these cohorts at different ages. And that's really important in terms of the Great Recession, in terms of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. We just want to keep that in mind. So now I'm going to go through lots of results really quickly, so buckle up, because what I'm going to do is just show you these, gets more exciting than the next one, which I thought we were getting to. What we're seeing here now is just the share of adults 26 to 30 with a college degree. This is men. And if we just look at the end of the chart there on the right, you see that big increases in education over the past 15 years, going from 26% for the people born in the late 70s, the late Gen Xers, to 34% for those born 1986 to 1990. And I should say that when we're talking about millennials, the definition of the millennials is really 1980, the people born 1980 to 2000. So if you're born in 2000, you're 17 now, probably retirement security shouldn't be the first thing on your mind. You should probably just worry about getting through high school. So we're really going to look at kind of really focusing on people from 1976 to 1990. So it's really not quite, millennials is a good marketing hook, and that's probably why we titled the paper that way. It's a little bit misleading. If we look at women, this is, you see their education too also increasing. So for the late 70s, 33% had a college degree, and now it's up to 40%. So much better educated than other folks. Okay, so now we're going to show these graphs. And each line is going to represent a different cohort. So you're going to see this repeatedly over the next 9 minutes and 25 seconds. And so the first line is going to be folks born in the 1941 to 45 cohort. This is for men. You see their labor force participation rates by age. The next chart, now we see men born 10 years later, so I'm only showing a few cohorts just to make it tractable. And you see participation rates a little bit lower until about age 55, and then you see working a little bit longer at the end there relative to folks born 1941 to 45. We continue, you just see that participation rates are sort of continually getting lower, particularly at midlife, and you see, or younger ages. And you see for the people born the men born 1986 to 1990, substantially lower participation rates. They're getting maybe a little bit better by the time they reach age 30. Maybe that big drop at age 21, 25, maybe that reflects their increased education. For women, the patterns are quite a bit different. So this is for women born in the early 1940s. You see that dip in participation rates in their mid-20s as they're leaving the labor force to raise families. You see that dip disappears as you get to later cohorts. So big increases in labor force participation in those ages, but now the more recent cohorts, you see it's really just kind of stagnating a little bit. And then again, these younger women the millennials are a bit different from the earlier cohorts, but again, some stagnation for women in labor force participation rates, still higher though than what you saw for the current retirees, those born in 1941 to 45. If we look at median earnings for full-time workers, this is for men, we see that each cohort for men, we see their median earnings is declining. And then it sort of stagnates, but certainly not earning nearly as much as the man did, and these are medians, born in 1941 to 45. So it's bad news. For women, we see that earnings had been increasing for full-time workers. But then these more recent cohorts, you see it's really just kind of stagnating. So a little bit concerning there. So that growth seems to have ended. Look at retirement plan coverage. I'm only going to show you results for men just because of time. This is CPS, because the CPS, the most recent CPS data on pension coverage seems to be off. They did a revision in 2014 that really has reduced pension coverage. I'm not showing the results for 2016, only through 2011. But even with these numbers, you do see that pension coverage, this is retirement plan coverage, employer-sponsored retirement plan coverage, for full-time working men has been pretty steadily declining by cohort. For women, it's not quite as bad, but a similar pattern. If we look at marriage, now I'm just going to show you for women, we see that marriage rates, women have been declining, have been delaying marriage, and also the share who are married, let's say in their 40s, has been declining a bit with cohorts. So as you get to the more recent cohorts, we see that the delay in marriage has continued, but it seems like that it's plateauing at about the same level as it was maybe for the women born in the late 1960s, and so that decline seems to have stopped. And of course, marriage is important because you can perhaps better accumulate wealth. If you're married, you can share expenses better. So that is an important part of retirement preparedness. If you look at home ownership, and now this is for individuals, not for households, so these results are a little bit different than maybe if you're used to just sort of home ownership rates at the household level. We see for individuals, this is men and women combined, again, this decline in home ownership. So again, a little bit concerning. How are things going with household wealth? So now this is data going from 1983 to 2013. And the cohort's a little bit different, but so the oldest cohort are people born 1928 to 1933 here. But we see that with each cohort, and particularly with this cohort born in the early 40s, having much more wealth, household wealth, than the cohort born 6 years earlier or 6 years earlier than the previous one. But again, you see that at the end, that shows at the end of each line, you see the big drop-off. That's from the impact of the recession and the financial crisis, 2007 to 2013. So even in 2013, 6 years, 5 years after the crisis, much lower levels of wealth, and that really has had a pretty long-term effect. You also see that as you get to later cohorts, that the increase that we're seeing in wealth is really diminishing from one cohort to another. We're not seeing this big increase anymore, and we are seeing the continued big decline after 2007 in terms of wealth, which could end up having some pretty long-term effects. We look at the folks born in 1976 to 81, they're quite a bit lower than some of the previous cohorts by their mid-30s. Looking at the components, I just want to talk about debt. This is the share of adults. And what's important to keep in mind with the Survey of Consumer Finances is we're only looking at householders and spouses. So we don't have the folks who are still staying with their parents at age 40. They're not in here, or even age 30. So that is important distinction with this data than the CPS data. But what we see is that there's increasing debt levels, or the percentage of folks with debt at older ages. So if you compare the yellow and the blue, you see, let's say, at the mid-60s, a pretty substantial increase in the share who have debt. At younger ages, not much difference by cohort, and we do see that the most recent cohort, 76 to 81, have a bit less debt, at least less likely to have debt. But in terms of people with debt, big increases over these cohorts. So you just see for each 6-year cohort that we add, it's just quite a bit above the two, let's say, below it. Also, though important to note, you do see that the decline in debt levels after 2007 as credit tightened. So that is one, perhaps, good news of the financial crisis. So very quickly, I just want to talk about some of our projections now. So this is DYNASIM-4. This is Urban's dynamic microsimulation model. And we're starting with a representative sample of adults of individuals and families from the 2004 and 2008 SIP. And then we're going to have equations that age the data year by year, looking at demographic outcomes and economic outcomes and health outcomes. And then we're using the latest data, the best available data that we can find, and we're benchmarking things to the Social Security projections and using the same assumptions that the Social Security trustees use. And so what we want to do is compare outcomes for 5 10-year birth cohorts from people born in the late 30s and early 40s to 76 to 85. So that's my definition of millennials for this part of the paper. We're going to look at 2 outcomes, age 70 income, and importantly, this income is going to include the flow you would get if you annuitized 80% of your financial assets and retirement accounts in an actually fair way. And then we're going to compute a retirement replacement rate, which would compare that age 70 income to your average annual earnings from age 50 to 54, both in real dollars. And then we're going to focus on a 75% replacement rate. See who falls below that 75% replacement rate. It's a crude measure, but to say, well, if you're falling below 75%, chances are you might have trouble maintaining your pre-retirement living standards after you stop working. So what do we find? So the first result is that for each a cohort, particularly for the last one, some pretty noticeable increases in the inflation-adjusted median income at age 70. That's the good news. And that's, again, here we're assuming that, I shouldn't say again because I haven't mentioned it before, but we're following the Social Security trustees' assumptions. We're assuming a 1.2% annual increase in the average wage growth over this period. So that's a pretty big increase. You get that wage increase for 30 years, the projection period we're looking at, and it turns out to be $42,000. So it does add up. But if you look at the share who, at the same time though, their working income, their earnings while they're working is increasing, and so the share who can replace 75% we see is a bit higher, 39%, than what we would get for the early boomers of 33%. So much more at risk of being unable to meet your retirement needs or to maintain your living standards in retirement. Some caveats though. This is these are projections for a long way out. A lot of things are evolving and we can't predict them. So we don't know how the macroeconomy is going to evolve. We don't know if people are going to work longer than we project. We're assuming here that Social Security benefits will not be cut to restore solvency, but if they are, things are going to look worse than what I showed. This assumes that people get the scheduled benefits. We also haven't looked at out-of-pocket healthcare spending. That's rising. That's another concern. And then we're just looking at the medians here, and there's a lot of heterogeneity within that group. And so the next step, we really want to look at who are the folks who are most at risk. Thank you.